Hello and welcome to Moderate Fantasy Violence, a podcast about pop culture and the world around it. I'm Nick.
And I'm Alistair.
And this fortnight we're talking about what might be two of the big cinema events of the year. Certainly between these two and The Odyssey, which we did last episode, we've got a fair bit of the discourse sewn up. I speak, of course, of Spider-Man Brand New Day, the latest Marvel Cinematic Universe film, and the mega-hit micro-budget horror film Obsession that came out a few months ago, which we have finally seen. But first, Alistair, what other things have you seen?
So I've been watching a film that was one of the big films of 2 years ago, 2024, part of the old going back and catching up on things that I didn't have a chance to see at the cinema at the time, but I've been meaning to get around to. So I watched the film Maxxxine, or Maxxxine, I don't know how you're supposed to pronounce it. It's Maxxxine, but with three X's.
Yeah, I've seen that going around, yeah.
So yeah, this is the third and final part of the X trilogy, which is X, Pearl and Maxxxine, in which, Mia Goth resumes her starring role as Maxine Minx, an adult film actress in the 80s in America. In this film, she's trying to go into mainstream acting by trying to get into horror movies in Hollywood, and while at the same time there's a serial killer going around knocking off women and mutilating them and doing various violent things. It is a particularly gory, quite dark film. It's probably a bit less of a horror film than the previous two. I kind of felt this one was more of a sort of violent thriller. It had quite a bit of gory and upsetting bits, but I guess maybe not quite as scary as the previous two. It was a good film in the sense. I thought it was quite good at catching the sort of febrile sense of the time. Yeah, it's quite good at sort of dripping in the background and in sort of adjacent to the plot, ongoing social issues, rising tensions between moral majority Christian people sort of protesting against the sort of decadent and satanic mainstream popular culture. So yeah, in this sense of kind of rising anger, rising tension, everyone's really angry and wanting to do violence on each other. Plus it's a general sense of a kind of moral breakdown of society through the sort of the rise of these things the porn industry becoming fairly mainstream, and also the sort of the era of the video nasty horror film, and also the fact there's a serial killer on the loose and people are just being kind of murdered with impunity, or at least the police don't seem to be able to catch him. Probably my favourite thing about it was this mood it created of this dark time when society's breaking down and everything's going a bit mad and violent, which was pretty good atmosphere to create for a film.
Yeah, whenever I've seen this film mentioned, I always struggle to remember it's not a spin-off from the XXX series starring Vin Diesel.
No, that was a different series from... Oh, God, that film must be more than 20 years old now. I think only Vin Diesel's in the first one. I think they might have had to downgrade to Exhibit for the later ones. I don't know how many they made, but yeah.
But this is very much a different tone of filmmaking by the sound of it.
It's unrelated in any way, shape or form. Yeah. The first one, I think, was a bit of a sort of underground hit. I suppose not too dissimilar to Obsession that we'll come to. Yeah, I had some, relatively... I guess, people who've been in a few things. This is definitely one of the things that made Mia Goth's name. Yeah, the first one. Yeah, the first one had the interesting concept of, as well as playing the kind of the final girl victim, Mia Goth also played the murderer. And they're different characters. She's playing the serial killer and she's playing the victim, and it's just slightly different, interesting take. The original one had a really good cast. Yeah, it was also one of Jenna Ortega's breakthrough roles. Made a name for the director. It was, one of those sort of viral sensation horror hits that come along every so often, partly because, as we discussed on the podcast, horror fans can be actually very open-minded and are much more willing to give, independent films or low-profile films a go if there's good buzz around it. There are also, horror fans can be some of the least open-minded people because they won't watch anything other than horror. This is, I think, what's responsible with this sort of steady rise of new voices coming through horror and these viral hits. And this was, X was one from quite a few years ago. And then again, I think they surprised everyone by doing a sequel. The second one, Pearl, was actually a prequel and set during the First World War, going for a different tone and a different period. And I think that caught people's attention. This third one is very much sort of wrapping things up at the end of the trilogy. It is probably the weakest. Although they're kind of each one's sort of standalone, definitely start with the first one. But at the same time, I did think this was a really good fitting end to this trilogy. A really good sort of dark, violent, quite disturbed thriller.
Okay, so it did at least have an ending then. It did at least wrap things up.
Yeah, it does wrap things up.
Okay.
And kind of come full circle, yeah. I mean, I don't know, it's a horror franchise, so I guess they could always make more. They seem to always find a way. It does sit quite nicely as a trilogy, and I've got enough respect for the people involved that they'll probably just leave it at that.
Or at least leave it enough years that it feels like more of an event when it comes back.
Yeah, that's true, rather than just trying to spin out one every few years. The cast is really strong. Yeah, again, Mia Goth is excellent, and she does horror film main character very well. Sophie Thatcher's in it as well. Also,
in every horror film for a period.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it seems to be leaning into her sort of slightly ethereal look and general horror vibes from everything from Companion to Yellow Jackets, which is all good stuff. Yeah, also Michelle Monaghan and Kevin Bacon, actually, who's probably the most high-profile star to appear in the films to date. In that, yeah, he's like, I guess, like a former A-lister and kind of Hollywood legend at this point. But I guess he's at the point where he does what he wants, and I guess he's a fan or whatever. But yeah, it's a small role in this, but yeah, big name, Kevin Bacon.
Yeah, I've heard of him. He's famously connected to everyone.
Yeah. The Kevin Bacon database. Yeah. Also, Giancarlo Esposito appears again, playing a sort of morally grey, slightly villainous type. Yeah, again, leading into his whole does a lot of villains thing post Breaking Bad. But yeah, again, they're getting high-profile people now that it's a sort of well-established franchise. But yeah, but they're all good and it's obviously all people I'm very much a fan of. Good casting, good film, good fitting end to it. Another reminder that these viral horror movies come along every so often, and they're worth chasing down and seeing what the fuss was about. This one certainly was probably the most high profile. It had a pretty big advertising campaign when it came out.
I do remember this coming out. I don't think I ever got as far as considering seeing it, but I did notice it existed.
I would recommend starting with the first one. The first one was probably my favourite of the three. The second one is very good, partly because they go in such a different direction, not only like setting a different time period, but it's got although it's still kind of a horror movie, it's got a much more of a magical realism tone to it, which was quite interesting. I mean, these films came through, I think, as part of the anti-horror movement or wave of recent horror movies predating the ones from this year. So that includes like films like Get Out, Midsommar, Nope, Us. Well, I'm just mentioning Jordan Peele films now, but yeah, a lot of films in that kind of thing, which are sort of horror movies, but play around with the tropes and stuff and do something a bit different and maybe go in a more character direction at the end or things like that and try and sort of do something different in the genre. So the X trilogy is very much a part of that. So if you're interested in horror movies and you're interested in people trying to be experimental with the genre, but still in a commercially savvy, entertaining way, then yeah, this is just a good opportunity to recommend the whole series and start with the first one, X. For my money, probably the best. So I've been chasing down old horror movies, as in 2 years old. Nick, what have you been up to since we last spoke?
I have been finally watching the latest season of a show I have rhapsodised about on this podcast before. This was For All Mankind, the alternate history space show from Apple TV about a world in which the space race continued and America and the USSR kept trying to outdo each other into space all through the late 20th and early 21st century, leading to, at this point, the fifth season is set in the 2010s. They've been jumping forward a decade each year, and now we're fully living on Mars. The species hasn't moved to Mars, but there's a Martian outpost, and we're getting to the point where it's been there so long that there are people who were born on Mars who have certain feelings about the corporate exploitation of Mars and the fact that what they're living on is basically a mining ship. It starts to get very complicated, ending, as it often does in this show, in violence and tragedy. I've seen the fifth season of that, and it's still pretty good. I think this show possibly never quite reached the glorious heights of the first two seasons, but this fifth one stays interesting and keeps pushing things forward. I enjoy the 1 decade jump every year because it at least forces them to bring in new concepts and new characters and stops things getting too stale. There's more interesting characters this year. Another couple of long-standing characters finally reached the climax of their storylines, I guess is the nice way of putting it. They've said it'll finish next year. Season 6 will be the last For All Mankind season. So yeah, they're reaching the 2020s, and I guess they're stopping there rather than going into the future. So I'll be interested to see how they wrap it all up. There's certainly some hints dropped at the very end of this season.
Yeah, that's one thing I was going to ask is this the conclusion? Are they building to the conclusion? Yeah, so it looks like this is the sort of laying the foundations for the final one next year.
Yeah, there's a couple of very big hints about what they might be doing, although I don't really have a clue exactly how they might end it, which is, I guess, a nice feeling. It's a show which has such a large scope and cast of characters and talks so broadly about things that the idea of bringing it back into a single unified climax sounds quite difficult, but fortunately I don't have to do it. One of the writers is Ronald D. Moore, who is, I think, known for his Star Trek work, which I haven't seen much of, and the Battlestar Galactica reboot in the 2000s, which I have seen. And yeah, he was good on that, and he's good here. Battlestar Galactica did famously go a bit weird at the end. I'll be interested to see if this also does.
Yeah, but it did maintain a pretty good plot line with many, many characters, situations, concepts, and sort of parallel things happening across 5 or so years. Yeah, was it 5 seasons or so in the end? I know the last one was split in half, whatever. To be fair, they did maintain it pretty well. If it went off the board at the end, bizarrely with Battlestar Galactica, I think if they just ended it literally with the second last season, then that would have actually been a brilliant ending and a brilliant show, but they just did a bit more. I guess there are other people involved, and maybe he's learned from what happened with Battlestar
Well, we'll be interested to find out. As I say, they're certainly not having the same religious overtones and hints of stuff that isn't really explained in quite the same way in For All Mankind. There's definitely a bit more focus on everything being broadly scientifically explainable. There's just been a few hints of things creeping in around the edge in the last season or so, which, anyway, I'm probably getting into spoiler territory. But yeah, I must admit it's probably not quite as good as it used to be, but I am still enjoying it, and I am still interested to see how they end it.
I mean, there's a lot of good shows that maybe have like hit their peak around season, I don't know, 3 or 4 or something like that, but then still remain good. They just never return to that peak, because I guess it's very hard to sustain something that's sort of top quality. I mean, even like The West Wing. I mean, it's kind of different, I suppose, because it changed showrunners, but I did feel that like The West Wing was consistently good. It's just never like that peak it hit around season 3, season 4. It never really got back to.
Yeah, I mean, they've set themselves this ambitious structure wherein they jump forward a decade every season, and they often have to therefore shed characters and situations between seasons, which on the one hand is quite ambitious, and I do enjoy, seeing how they cope with it and seeing each season being a sort of a slightly different show with a slightly different setup. But it does inevitably mean that sometimes the new characters or new setups aren't quite as compelling as the previous ones. It does give you a fairly stark comparison point. But, I thought this one was probably one of the better ones of the last few years, to be honest. I thought season 3 was probably the weakest, and they have at least been on a bit of an upswing since then. Season 3, I think, was when they first had to really start replacing characters in quite large quantities, because they were really starting to run out of people from the first 2 seasons. And I think they found it a bit awkward at first, but they started to get a handle on it just in time for the ending.
Yeah, interesting. I suppose they must have a pretty large cast of characters that's been through the show at this point. I suppose it's supposed to be like an alternative history, so they have enough people to fill out a history, yeah.
Yeah, although they are somewhat ruthless about cycling out either fatally or sometimes non-fatally characters who just aren't really contributing much. Like, there's a couple of characters from previous seasons who are still alive, although often are quite old from previous years, who are still in this season but just not very much, just basically turning up for like a few scenes or glorified cameos.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, and I suppose the whole sort of 10 years between seasons probably makes them feel a bit more self-contained, I suppose, as they need to kind of wrap themselves up a bit more, because you can't do like a cliffhanger that's picked up literally in the next season, as all the shows do.
Not really, no, or at least you have to be a bit clever about it, It has to be a cliffhanger that kind of leads into the next big developments, This means this, which therefore means the whole direction of society for the next 10 years. When they pull it off, it's really good. They always have a sort of flash forward at the end of each season. Like, the very last scene of each season is a jump to the next time period, and they always, throw forward, do some sort of big, ambitious, panning special effects sequence, and play a famous song from the next era to introduce you to it. So, at the end of the last season, they chucked us forward to the 2020s and played Blinding Lights by the Weeknd. So yes, it's happening.
Right, yeah, very much getting very close to the present, yeah. But that's also a good way to have a cliffhanger of being like, next season's going to be about this. Like,
well, yeah, it's a little teaser, a little bit of, this is where we're going next. Which does, It does get you psyched up, at least until you realise that this show's quite complex and expensive, and it'll almost definitely be about 2 years before we get any more.
Yeah, so they're not doing a sort of strict one a year.
Oh god, no. It's been one every 2 years for at least the last few seasons, I think. Well, they have now started a spin-off called Star City, set in the Russian city, which I haven't yet seen. It's on the to-do list, but we've been tempted away to watch the second season of The Pit, because we love The Pit.
Star City's a real place. I suppose probably a lot of the locations are. So yeah, that's an interesting idea for a spin-off. But yeah, it does seem like they've been sort of fairly regularly bringing them out. It's not been like some shows where they wait, it sort of sporadically comes out every 4 years or something like that.
It's regular, it's just not annual, yeah.
Yeah. Well, this has definitely been on the list of something to catch up on. Yeah, this is a good reminder that, got about 2 years to get through 5 seasons so we can be current with the final season.
Yeah, as I've said before, I think you'd like it, but
yeah.
Plenty of time.
Next up, this episode, we will be discussing Spider-Man, Brand New Day, the new film in the MCU and the 4th Spider-Man film starring Tom Holland and Zendaya. This film picks up where the previous one left off, with Aunt May having died and then Spider-Man having to cast a spell that means that everyone forgets him, including MJ, his girlfriend. This then picks up a few years later. MJ has returned from university back to Manhattan, and Peter Parker is wondering about whether he can get back into her life. At the same time, there is a mysterious new villain on the scene who seems to be capable of moving from person to person with sinister ends, and also the Spider-Man has been dealing with the Punisher going on the old crime-killing rampage, as he does every so often. Nick, you are our resident Spider-Man expert, our chief spiderologist, master of the Spider-Man arts. What did you make of this film?
You know what? Yeah, I'll take the expert crown on this occasion. I was a little concerned I was going to come out of this thinking that the Tom Holland Spider-Man era was getting into its sort of zombified, should have finished earlier phase. But no, this was very enjoyable, to be honest. I really like this. Especially as a long-term Spider fan who likes to see him bopping around New York, just punching relatively grounded supervillains, rather than, leaving the country or hopping dimensions. Yeah, I liked this. This was very classic Spider action. The costume looks very bright and old school. It feels like there's at least a bit more of a sense of heavy practical effects or some kind of special effects that looks a bit more realistic. Things seem a bit heavier in this film, which I enjoyed. I just enjoyed the lower scale, old school Spidey action. I could do without him having access to like god level surveillance tech, but otherwise, yeah, solid ground level superhero stuff, and actually had a coherent emotional arc with Peter's sadness about his friends not being able to remember him as well, which I think puts it above some rather less resonant superhero films. So yeah, no, I enjoyed this. I thought this was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I thought
apart from the bits that were quite sad.
Yeah, I mean, it's fun in the sense of like a movie about a sort of tortured, introspective Spider-Man. This is definitely, we find Spider-Man in sort of emo mode, where he's sad and he lives alone in an attic at the top of a building and has no friends and things like that. Yeah, but it's still, I don't know, entertaining. I don't feel it's not like overly melodramatic. I mean, I think based on that description I just gave, I can imagine people thinking this is like a sort of Zack Snyder brooding, overly serious take on Spider-Man. And I mean, if you liked what was in the previous Tom Holland Spider-Man, you basically get another helping of that. But the good thing about that is these are some of the best films that the MCU have made. So we've got really strong cast. Tom Holland's really good. Zendaya's really good. They've added some new faces as well. I'm sure we'll get to them. And there is still the signature humour and, lots of laughs and lots of entertainment. It did feel maybe not quite as consistently funny as the previous three, but they are some of the funniest of the MCU films. I know the MCU signature is very much action plus some jokes and witty banter, but I felt what made the Spider-Man movies come out when they released Spider-Man Homecoming was they really took the humour up another level. It was more than just like, an action movie with a guy in it who makes some sarcastic quips or whatever, like Iron Man does, and that there were some generally funny set pieces and comedic characters. And this is, definitely among the funnier of the MCU films. But yeah, I guess maybe a bit of damning with faint praise, but it's not quite as funny as some of the others, but it's still pretty consistently funny, despite also being, as you say, have a real emotional heart to it. So good job there.
Yeah, I liked the way they actually continued the storyline they set up at the end of the last movie and actually, acted like it matters. Sometimes with Marvel films, one gets the feeling that even when something was obviously set up at the end of the last film, when the time comes to actually make the next film, they're a bit sort of, actually, can we be bothered with that? No, let's just either ignore it or scrap it off in like 2 scenes. But this film does actually, commit to the real implications of what happened in the last film. They act like it actually matters, and it works. His loneliness feels sincere. The way he can only connect to his friends through his phone feels, all too relatable, even for those of us who haven't been erased from their minds. Tom Holland plays it very well, I think. He's doing a good job of being, likeable and connecting us to his angst, but without becoming annoyingly or unwatchably angsty. The spider male loneliness epidemic is real. And yeah, I thought this was, as I say, a surprisingly emotional viewing experience at times. Maybe that's why it's less funny, I guess. Maybe it's just because, it's just a bit less of a bouncy, upbeat film than previous ones sometimes were.
That's a good point. That is a good point. Yeah, they are maybe aiming at a slightly different tone here. And yeah, there is a sense, though, of these Spider-Man movies. There is like a sort of consistent arc across these 4, and I guess leading into any others they decide to make. I think this has made like $1 billion already, so I can imagine there will probably be more of it, which is good. But you do feel this as a sort of consistent emotional arc, which is very much rooted in the characters. The ongoing story of these Spider-Man movies is the growth of Peter Parker as a character and his relationship with MJ and his friends and some of the other characters, his friends and mentors and family members. And that's what keeps you coming back for more, this sense of like, I like these people, I like their relationships, I want kind of more of that, as well as obviously like plenty of like Spider-Man hanging off a building and fighting a guy in like a sort of cybernetic scorpion suit, which you also get.
Well, yeah, like they've managed to keep this trio of, Tom Holland as Spider-Man, Zendaya as MJ, and Jacob Batalon as their friend Ned, who have been consistent throughout the 3 films, and you are at this point somewhat invested in their friendship and their relationship, and it does actually feel sad when Tom Holland stares at them, longing for what he can never, brackets, at least not for now, have. And as a result, it works. Zendaya still gets a decent amount to do, because I guess, they know that if you've got Zendaya in your movie, give her something to do, despite the mind wipe. Jacob Batalon as Ned does perhaps have to be in the movie a bit less because of the amnesia plot. Someone has to actually be off screen so we can feel their absence a bit. And as I say, they're not going to not use Zendaya, so alas, Ned. But he still gets some moments.
It's because a few good scenes, and you kind of want an MJ in your Spider-Man movie as well, even if they're separate. But it makes it feel more tortured if you, because you know that, like, you know, Spider-Man and MJ are one of these great like fictional romance stories, and if they're not together, then you know something's not right in the world of Spider-Man. And they've got quite a lot going on in this film. Is one of the things is that there are a lot of different like elements to it. Part of me did feel that like it might have been slightly tighter if they'd maybe focused it down a bit more. I mean, because they've got, as well as what we discussed, the whole plot of Spider-Man losing MJ and his then trying to rekindle that relationship and the kind of conflict between the two characters. We've also got him trying to overcome the trauma of his aunt dying, so a surrogate mother figure who he very much blames himself for, and then now he has this insistence he must go solo to protect the people around him. Plus there's also another plot line focused on a personal conflict of him turning into a spider, or his mutations or whatever accelerating, and then he has to kind of accept the spider within him, which is a sort of an arc. And then we've got this new villain, which I'm sure we'll get to in detail, and the relationship with the Punisher, also the Hulk's in this film.
Very much how the Hulk's role feels, by the way. Also, the Hulk is in this film.
Yeah.
In a way, but he could probably have been cut out, but you know, why not have the Hulk in the film?
Yeah, and the Hand was in it, although very briefly, and obviously they had Scorpion as well in this film, who's not the villain, or one of the main villains, but there were quite a lot of elements, and I don't think any particular element was bad. I mean, like I say, the Hulk could be cut out. I mean, a lot of the introspection about him becoming a spider, a lot of the introspection about him, you know, feeling sad after the death of his aunt, and a lot, obviously, his feeling sad after he loses his friendship and his love. None of these elements are bad. I just felt it is quite a lot, and maybe it could have benefited from being pared down and focused a bit more on like what is the growth that Spider-Man, Peter Parker are trying to go through in this film. But that said, like, again, there was a real sense of tension with the whole thing of him sort of becoming a spider, losing himself. And it's kind of related to the fact that as he's given up his Peter Parker life to be Spider-Man, is he losing himself in this, you know, like literally losing himself to this alter ego. So none of it's bad. In fact, it's all good. It's just a lot, I suppose.
Yeah, there was definitely a lot going on. I mean, as a comics reader, there's a part of me that quite liked the sheer packedness of it. Like, I did feel like I'd read, you know, a solid 4 or 5 issues worth of Spider-Man comic after I'd read this. You know, he got through several, like, different, separate, like, episodic moments, like jumping from fight to fight or event to event. He's done that, gone to bed, and then woken up and been confronted with that. I did kind of appreciate the way it just felt like a very busy world with a lot going on. Just because, I don't know, as I've said before, Spider-Man is a kind of a soap opera character, and that's arguably how it should feel. I mean, I've also said before that, in my opinion, Spider-Man should be a TV show, because that's clearly the form in which it's better suited, but I guess there's not enough money in television to make a decent Spider-Man show. Therefore, we must have these movies. So these movies can at least be, you know, crammed with soap opera and insolence.
I think, as you said in the pub afterwards, they're just our cinema characters and there are TV characters, and that just seems to be the way Hollywood's set up, even with the blurring of the line between TV and film we've had recently. But you're right, the fact there's a lot going on makes it feel like a rich world with a lot happening, and you get a decent amount of soap opera. And I do like the fact that, like, Spider-Man has relatable things going on in his life, as well as like the superhero stuff, and it's all kind of very well connected. I mean, that's what we've said before about what makes Spider-Man work, is that, like, you know, Spider-Man 2, which is also a really good film, like, it's about his relationship with his mentor, his academic mentor, Doc Ock, as well as him as Spider-Man fighting Doc Ock in machine crazed multi-legged form. And in this version, yeah, even the things like about him turning into a spider, it's related to an everyday sort of thing of like accepting the person you are and accepting your past and the trauma that you've been through and growing. And Spider-Man feels much more relatable, even though he's going through these superhero things, than a lot of other superheroes. Like, he's much more relatable than, say, Thor, for example, even though, you know, they do romance plots and family relationships to make Thor not seem too like remote and godlike, but it's just works so much better with Spider-Man, who feels like the most relatable of the main superheroes.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's always been Spider-Man's thing, a sort of lovable sad sack who, every time things go well for Spider-Man, they must go badly for Peter Parker, and vice versa. He's just constantly in conflict with himself, and it's worked for years, and it keeps working here. I will admit, the turning into a spider thing, I don't mind it. In fact, I found some of it quite entertaining, but it didn't feel like it really went anywhere, almost. It did feel like the one thing that could have been taken out of the film, except, I guess, arguably, maybe it needed to be in there to set up the inhibitor thing that plays plays a part in the climax, so etc, etc. It's all bound together into one gigantic whole.
Yeah, and it does work quite well. It works well as like a plot that like unfolds, and like kind of all the different elements of it link up quite well, and like each one propels into the next one, and like there's a real sense of forward momentum. Each scene's leading to the next thing. It's tense and it's well paced, because it's also quite long as well. It's like 2 hours 20 minutes, something like that.
Yeah.
But it doesn't feel particularly long. It feels well paced and it feels very entertaining. Yeah, so all the elements are working together. As I said, there's just a lot of them.
Yeah. And after a few years where it felt like they have been slightly shortening the superhero movies a little bit, there've been quite a few that have come in, under 2 hours. This is, a full fat 2.5 hour big boy. And it's... And it does work for the most part. As I say, I did occasionally think, this film could have not had the Hulk in it and been like 10 minutes shorter. But on the other hand, I was not in any way bored or disliking it when the Hulk was on screen. So
yeah, and one of the things I did like about it as well, which is, I don't know if we're getting into spoiler territory, but we're not going to spoil like the ending of the film, at least not yet. And this is stuff that's now all over the internet, so you probably know if it's there. But what I liked about it is the way they sold the film was very much like the big things going to be in this film are like the Hulk, Scorpion, the Hand, and they're on like all the posters, all the trailers. They're on the side of the bus.
I do feel like we should leave spoiler space before we spoil the name of the villain, if that's what we're about to spoil.
Yeah, well, not just yet. But then what I was going to say is there was this new villain who didn't seem to be in any of the trailers, and meant that actually they, for such a high profile film and such a big thing in the MCU, they did a pretty good job of keeping actually some of the details secret, at least for the people who haven't like mercilessly read up on them. So there were quite a lot of surprises, and I feel maybe this is the point now to start saying disappear if you don't want spoilers.
Yeah. No, the identity of the villain is, I guess it must be a spoiler, as they've been careful not to tell anyone. So yeah, I guess we're going to spoil that now. But yeah, long story short, I think we both enjoyed this. It's probably one of the most fun superhero movies in a while, and it's made an absolute bumload of money. So clearly someone agrees.
Okay, cool. That's your chance for spoilers.
Okay.
Again, Nick is the master of the Spidey arts. The honour's all yours.
Okay, well, we're actually getting out a bit outside the Spidey arts here, but yeah, of course, although both Scorpion and Tombstone are in this film, the main villain, the one who gets the big showdown at the end, well, sort of. It becomes a bit murky who's a villain, really. But yeah, the main superpowered threat, I guess, is a girl in a hoodie played by the famously red-headed actor Sadie Sink from Stranger Things, who, after a few little cameos and guest shots, turns out to be Jean Grey of X-Men fame, occasionally aka Phoenix. So yeah, she has telepathic powers, she can control people's minds, which in this film mostly manifests as her controlling people's bodies and then jumping between controlled bodies over a distance of about 30 feet, which is a fun little sort of visual trick to make the action sequences interesting. They get a few like fun long tracking shots of her like jumping between people throughout the film. And yeah, Jean Grey is the villain, which got a decent gasp in our cinema. I had heard rumours of this beforehand, and my main thought was, okay, I'm going to be mildly annoyed if it turns out that the Spider-Man film feels like a trailer for an X-Men film. But I think they did manage to navigate around that for the most part by basically not mentioning mutants or the X-Men.
Yeah, it felt very much like a story in its own right, and things like that. It did not feel like it was a big setup for the film they're going to make next, so as some films very much do feel. And I successfully didn't know about this, and like I say, I'm relatively on it for the cinema stuff, like, follow Film Twitter or Film Blue Sky and film stuff on Instagram, and watched all the trailers for this Spider-Man movie and seen the promotion and things like that. So they did a good job of keeping that a secret, that this was going to be the villain. And the other thing is, having a villain who psychically possesses people, you can have quite a long bit, or at least the first half of the film or so, when the villain's mysterious, we don't know who it is, just a sort of formless, shapeless presence that moves into people's bodies, then moves out, played by, almost every actor in the film at one point or another, and before eventually the revelation of who it is. And that's quite tense and quite different, and that's what I think made it the most interesting. Was like, this is not something I've seen before, and this is not an approach I can really think of, at least not for a while, in a Marvel movie, of keeping like a big twist like that secret and not using it as a way to sell the film, so that if you go to the film, you get a big surprise when you're there. Yeah, I really like that, because I was thinking like, Spider-Man movie, good stuff, it's good fun. There's a lot of interesting emotional things going on with like picking up from the last movie, but who's the villain going to be this time? Is it just going to be like the Hand or the Scorpion, some kind of, let's be polite and say B-list Spider-Man villains maybe, but like, oh no, they've actually got something up their sleeve to make it a more interesting film than what I anticipated.
Yeah, there's a lot of good uses. There's some good diving into Jean Grey's character towards the end. There's a good scene where she possesses Zendaya and torments Spider-Man directly from his estranged girlfriend's mouth, which is a particularly good and actively, genuinely quite sad and borderline upsetting scene, actually. So that's good stuff.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And obviously it works well because it's Zendaya, who's a great actor, and also the fact that, like, at this point, Jean Grey is not on screen, so you need someone to portray this villain, and it's good to that, obviously, using Zendaya, that's one of the most talented people in the cast. And, you know, there's various bits, obviously, you see Jean possessing the Hulk, you see Jean possessing the Punisher. That works well. And also, yeah, I guess bold choice of Jean Grey as a villain, someone who, if you stop someone in the streets and ask them about if they'd heard of the character, they assume good person, one of the X-Men, one of the good guys. But there's a compelling reason why she's a villain in this film.
Yeah, as I say, it does somewhat turn from villain to merely a sort of uneasy antagonistic role towards the end, and it does turn out, perhaps inevitably, but the real baddies was the big government organisation.
Well, it's a familiar arc, but it is an emotionally satisfying one, which is that, there's a villain, you know, your hero fights the villain because the villain is, like, motivated to do some destruction or whatever. Turns out the villain had a valid point and had been wronged, and the people who, you know, the hero was fighting for actually turned out to be the ones doing the wronging. And then there's a reversal at the end, and there's growth in our heroes, you know, Peter Parker, as he comes around to doing the right thing and supporting the right side. And it's not a new plot structure, but it is a very emotionally satisfying one. And I was sitting there watching the film, again with the critic thing going in the back of my head, saying, there's got to be more to it than this. There's got to be something coming. It can't just be like Spider-Man fights Jean Grey, who's evil this time. Like, there's going to be a thing that, like, inverts it at the end. And that was there, and I found that, like I say, emotionally satisfying. If they hadn't done that, it might have been a less emotionally satisfying film to watch.
Yeah, no, Sadie Sink does a good job in the part once she's properly on screen, and did successfully make me think, okay, yes, I would like to go and watch you in that X-Men film. I'm interested to see where they take the character next, if they actually manage to carry on with some emotional continuity from this one. If they do move forward into, you know, the mutant race coming to the surface in the MCU, it's interesting that Spider-Man, a random teenager, has already managed to make a device that negates their powers.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, this organisation called Damage Control, a sort of, security and enforcement organisation, is the villain. And, you know, again, you could maybe draw some inspirations about contemporary politics. The heavily armed people who want to lock up people who they accuse of being dangerous maybe are the villains and not the heroes.
Yeah, it's not quite as aggressively on that particular nose as perhaps some of the stuff in season 2 of Daredevil was, but it's definitely floating around a similar ballpark, yeah.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Some of the freedom fighters are making the right thing. I mean, this film does also have the Punisher in it.
He is the one thing I haven't touched on yet, yeah.
Yeah, the Punisher in it, you know, a man who is very much like takes justice into his own hands and meets out frontier justice on the mean streets of New York. It's more like a sort of an even more heavily armed version of Travis Bickle from Taxi Driver.
Yeah, although that side of him isn't being enormously played up in large chunks of this film. He's more doing this sort of grumpy Uncle Frank thing with Peter Parker, which is very entertaining. John Bernthal and Tom Holland do have very good chemistry. Bernthal just in general is quite a charismatic person to watch. So it does work in the moments. You do occasionally sit there and thinking, wow, how many people has this guy killed? And if Spider-Man's sitting here having this sort of conversation with him, is he cool with that or what?
I guess it's one of those things with the MCU that you have to a degree suspend disbeliefs between the different strands of the film. Like, for example, like Tony Stark solves everything with science, but this is also the same universe that there's Doctor Strange doing literal magic. You've just got to accept it that, like, they're sort of in the same universe but sort of not. So this is simultaneously is the Punisher from the Punisher special we reviewed a few episodes ago, where he just kills like a huge number of people, but also simultaneously he is also a nicer Punisher who could be friends with Spider-Man.
Yeah, and that's kind of sort of how it works in the comics as well, between the Punisher's appearances in, you know, the more PG-rated comics and his own slightly more violent ones. So there's a part of you who also likes seeing them take that into the movies as well. Although it is also quite funny that they've made a film with a major Punisher subplot in which they cannot say the word Punisher, presumably to stop the kids searching that word on Disney Plus and finding the incredibly violent TV shows.
Yeah, it is an interesting creative choice they've made. So he's just always called Frank. Yeah, no indication. Although, he's got the Punisher t-shirt and things like that.
Yeah, he has got the full costume with the massive skull, so you can still Google image search him, kids.
Yeah, I'm sure maybe they're just like setting up it's a sort of educational program for kids.
Who is that incredibly cool man in the skull shirt?
Yeah, that's going to end well with AI search to help them along the way. But John Bernthal, again, he's good at the Punisher, and he's good in this, again, being very much the straight man to, in the more humorous moments, as these Spider-Man films are known for. I mean, as we said, John Bernthal does grizzled, tough soldier guy very well. So, he's perfect casting for the Punisher, just as he was perfect casting for Menelaus, who, when we discussed in The Odyssey in the last film, like two of the biggest films of this year have Tom Holland, Zendaya, and John Bernthal in it. So they're collectively having having a pretty good time of it.
Well, yes, I'm sure we can spend a while in our end-of-year film review discussing how a huge amount of the major films this year have some combination of Zendaya, Holland, Pattinson and Bernthal in them. That seems to be the current generation of big stars.
And Florence Pugh, who's also in this film briefly.
And Florence Pugh's in this as well, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, very much a cameo role, but that was also nice that they kept that secret. That was a nice extra turn-up, and obviously she's in the 2 Doomsday films, both, the new Dune film and the new Avengers film, so she's having a good year as well. So yeah, there's just basically a small group of people who are now literally in everything.
Yes, that's just what happens. It just for some reason seems slightly more concentrated this year.
Yeah. But, even though the Florence Pugh character's appearance is linking into the wider MCU and, the ongoing plans they've got for, the new Avengers movie, but to be honest, this does, and like a lot of Spider-Man films do, feels a bit more self-contained in some way. I mean, it's also setting up an X-Men movie, but I do get the sense of, like, Spider-Man being one of the most popular Marvel characters. I mean, when Stan Lee died, most of his obituary headlines were Stan Lee, creator of Spider-Man and X-Men. All the things he created, including the Avengers, who were massive at the time and still are. They didn't put in his obituary first line, Stan Lee, creator of the Avengers, Stan Lee, creator of Spider-Man. Spider-Man is a big deal, very popular. So there is, I think, a concerted element to make these films stand alone a bit, because there are people who will come to see a Spider-Man movie, but probably don't want to get caught up in the rest of the MCU or just aren't very interested in it. But they do love Spider-Man and they want to see Spider-Man movies, and they particularly want to see this flavour of Spider-Man with Tom Holland and Zendaya and this bit more humour and the rest of it. And this film does deliver across that.
Oh yeah. No, it's another good one. I believe some of their interviews around this film have mentioned this as the start of a new trilogy, which I guess the name Brand New Day does also kind of imply. And yeah, you know what? If they want to make another 2, I'll watch them. Sure thing. Kind of hope they just hurry up and make those instead of dicking around with other films. But we'll have to wait and see.
Finally, this episode, we will be discussing Obsession, a new horror movie directed by Cory Barker and starring Indy Neveretti and Michael Johnston. This has been one of the viral hits of this year, similar to X, as we discussed before about viral horror movies from new or independent creators. The plotline follows Bear, a lonely man who has a long-running crush on his close friend Nikki. When he purchases a possibly magical item and makes a wish on it, she then falls desperately in love with him. However, after fulfilling all his dreams, this then leads to a intense, violent, and possibly murderous obsession. We've seen this film in the cinema recently. It came out a few months ago, but as I said, it's been one of the viral hits of the year, so we just had to talk about it. Nick, what did you think?
Yeah, I went into this knowing absolutely nothing apart from the title and the fact that people liked it and it was very successful. So I did wonder if I was setting myself up to be massively traumatised. Because, okay, the one thing I did know is it was a horror film. So I was sort of prepared to be, really, really scared and upset. But happily that didn't quite go that way. Yeah, it's a good film. It's a nice combination of sort of sincerely upsetting and unsettling in a sort of grounded way, but also a sort of enjoyable, rattle-along sort of dark comedy vibe at times. Like there was some genuine laughs in our cinema alongside the, people jumping at the scares. And a certain sense of sort of knowing, slightly campy silliness at times in this film. Again, alongside this sort of supernatural obsession as a sort of metaphor for genuine toxic relationships, which is also, depressing if you think about it. So yeah, I enjoyed this. It's a very different beast to Brand New Day in, but it's got a very simple one-strand plot rather than the 17 plots of that Spider-Man film, which is just allowed to play out and sort of pull us slowly into it. But it's very well handled. I enjoyed it. It was good.
Yeah, I mean, this film is really good. It's one of those like viral hits that is a hit because it's good, and the word has got around, and the fact that it was still showing on like a Tuesday night, months after its release, is an indication of there's still lots of people who want to see it or possibly even see it again. It is like really, really tense, and there's a lot of build up, and there's a lot of good like jump scares and dark and unsettling bits, and it builds to a pretty like, unpleasantly awful ending. So it's kind of what you want from like your horror movies. Plenty of jumps, plenty of nasty bits, a real sense of like the sort of the tension rising as like the screws tighten further and further. And just some bits were just generally well constructed to be just disturbing and upsetting. It's one of those films that trying to go to sleep after I got home, you find it creeping into your mind, hard to let go of. The next day you just feel a bit out of sorts with these dark images cropping up in you. And yeah, sort of film that gets under your skin a bit, which is again what you also want from like a really good horror movie. I mean, I've definitely seen horror movies that had more jumps and more kind of bangs and more kind of nasty things that jump out at you. There's plenty of those about. We saw trailers for at least 2 or so of them before this film, but it's one of those films like they're kind of scary when you watch them, and obviously there's an art to making people jump, but it's not the most difficult thing in the universe. But those films are quite scary, but then after you leave the cinema, you're basically like, that was that, I'll go back to my life, and it just sort of washes off you. There's something deeper here that kind of gets under your skin and stays with you for a bit, and I do keep finding myself coming back to thinking about elements of it and some of the nasty things that we saw. So in that sense, that's what made it, I think, such a good film.
Yeah, I mean, it does have some fairly freaky shit towards the end, especially, but a lot of the time it's quite grounded. A lot of the awful things that are happening are things that, only a few steps up from what could happen in your real life. Like, there's various scenes where, various characters try and explain what's happening, or like there's a few conversations that the main character has with his friends about whether he's, taking advantage of the fact that she's just a bit upset, which is why she's got into this really intense relationship with him, rather than it being, the far more obvious supernatural curse option. And that stuff does seem like vaguely plausible and vaguely understandable, and it's that sort of thing which makes it resonant. I think it does eventually build, as I say, to a bit of a head of freaky supernatural stuff, but it does it quite slowly and gradually. Like, this film's about hour and 3/4, 100 minutes, 100 and a bit minutes, and I'd say up to about half an hour before the end it's still quite grounded stuff. It only gets really weird at the very, very end. A lot of the time before that it's just very slowly building with these occasional sort of strange moments.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, unlike a lot of the best of these kind of horror movies, that there is a bit, at least relatively early on, when there's a sense of like, has he made a wish and got what he wanted, but obviously a horrible, dark inversion of it? Or is it possibility that actually this woman, which he doesn't know as well as he thinks he does, is just having a breakdown, or she is generally a bit unhinged and is being possessive and behaving in this sort of strange way? It kind of plays with that sense of like, is there anything supernatural going on, or is she just like, having some horrible breakdown or on drugs or something like that? It's not like spun out as a big thing, but it is what keeps in this sort of like believable sense before it escalates and gets into the sort of the magic and things like that. And also I felt the characters just generally throughout the film behaved in a very believable way. They go like, there's a lot of like, what the fuck's going on, and like, this is all a bit sudden, isn't it? And like, I'm not sure about this, and he's sort of suspicious at first, Bear, the main character, when the girl who he's been friends with but just very much friends with and he's already secretly loved for so long suddenly is like into him, and then like super into him, and he's like, there's an element of people I think behaving quite realistically, whereas a lot of horror movies rely on people behaving unrealistically and getting themselves into ridiculous scrapes.
Yeah, I mean, there have been a few, what I guess one could basically describe as incel horror movies in the last few years, as I guess that issue has been in the zeitgeist, where the real monster is the man's shitty attitude to women. And this film, I think, trickles that out a bit more slowly. It maybe makes it a bit less simple than just he's a raving incel, but he clearly doesn't care enough about this woman's autonomy to value it over him getting what he wants.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And there's like films like Companion that we talked about before is another one, is that like it's kind of about men's desire for women, and also that like not really seeing a woman as a full person, as more as something they want to have and something like that, and also willing to do whatever it is to get a woman or the woman they want. I thought this film was pitched really well in the sense of like the main character is quite relatable. I mean, he's obviously like a bit of a loser, but I think lots of people relate to someone who's had a crush on a friend. Obviously everyone relates to having an unrequited crush. I think a vast majority of people have on some level wished someone they have an unrequited crush on would fall in love with them. Most people don't go as far as like buying something from a magic shop, but everyone's on some level wished like, God, it would just be great if that person was just like woke up in love with me tomorrow. Wouldn't that be perfect? It's very relatable, and he's not like a bad person. He's just a bit ineffectual, not very good at expressing himself, but also not assertive as well, but also a bit self-obsessed or just a bit narcissistic in the sense of like focused very much on like his own internal life. He's also like, his friends are kind of a bit douchey, which makes him a bit more sympathetic, but also they're not like super douchey. They're kind of, again, relatable, normal people, but also kind of makes you feel better because his friends are, a bit nasty to him and stuff, in the way of like, these aren't great friendships. And there's a sense of like, you can kind of sympathize with him and like why he does what he does. And obviously he does the classic like, the gods punish us by granting us our fondest wishes. He gets the one thing he wants and it turns out to be an unending nightmare. But I do think it's very well pitched at the level of like, you can kind of connect to this guy, relate to him and understand why he does what he does, and then feel sorry for him when he suffers a lot.
Well, yeah, there's various bits throughout the film where Nikki, the real Nikki, the woman he's made obsessed with him, resurfaces and, is clearly absolutely traumatized and horrified with what's happening, which he sort of clearly sees and just sort of finds it in him to sort of skip past, which do not paint him in an amazing light. by the end, by the time that's happened a few times.
Yeah, yeah. And again, there's like someone who's like on some level holding someone against their will. He's also very unsympathetic. But I guess it's like, it's understandable, not excusable.
It's something you can probably imagine someone doing, I guess, is probably the key point here.
Yeah, and a lot of horror movies rely on people behaving either in ridiculous or unnatural sort of ways in order to, either being cartoonishly evil or cartoonishly stupid. And this is more believable and more relatable because it's not like that. And also, I just feel the way it's constructed is quite well pitched, and it's kind of hard to describe without seeing the film, but it is a lot of thought, I think, has gone into these characters and who they are and how they relate to each other and how they relate to regular people.
Yes, and on the other end of the character coin, I guess, Indy Navarrete as Nikki is really, really good in this. I knew her from Superman and Lois, where she played a reasonably straightforward sort of teen drama girlfriend character, but she's fully unleashing here. There's both the initial version of the character, who's this sort of quite sarcastic, aloof girl who you can sort of imagine this quite quiet guy getting a crush on, and then there's this crazed, obsessed version who slowly builds from there, especially when she gets to, fully go wild as the weird, obsessed version, pulling some fully demented facial expressions, whiplashing from one state of mind to another. It's a very, very good performance.
Yeah, no, she's brilliant. She's brilliant. This film is predominantly a success because she's just amazing as the subject, the focus, I guess, the main character on some level. She's excellent in the role. I really, hope that she goes on to do a lot more roles and a lot more varied roles because she can clearly really, really act. And it's just very unsettling in this film, flipping from being like, it's a bit twee and kind of silly to like disturbingly violent to just dark, and also like, as you say, making quite disturbed, twisted facial expressions, in some ways just like moving in a way that's just like uncanny and like disturbed. Like there's one bit when he like wakes up in the night and she's just like watching him sleep, and just the way she moves around the room is just like really just quite uncanny and just like odd, which like really, again, it's one of those unsettling things that gets under your skin about the film, and it's all in the performance.
Yeah, there's a lot of the things which both are particularly unsettling about it and which maybe make you understand why the main character is able to just sort of quietly pretend everything's okay. It's because there's a lot of these moments where something really weird happens just for like a few seconds or a few minutes, and then she sort of goes back to acting normally in the way I guess we all have, sort of go, oh, maybe that was just a brief weird thing that that someone did or that my washing machine did. I'm sure it'll be fine. I'm sure it's not going to explode.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Again, we've all thought that at some point. Yeah. And some of it is also like quite, as you mentioned, it's quite darkly funny. It's kind of a bit Peep Show-esque in the sense of like a lot of it is people doing really cringe things in public, and like the height she takes as a obsession. A lot of it is like most of it takes place at like bars, workplaces, parties, things like that are some of the key scenes. People behaving crazy and like absolutely over the top in public. It's disturbing. You see someone do that, and obviously someone who's clearly somewhere between extremely mentally unwell or demonically possessed, but also it's kind of like funny in a sort of Peep Show way. I was like, I can't believe someone actually just did that. So and it's one of those things that like sometimes you can't tell whether you want to scream or laugh.
Yeah, there's a lot of party scenes or social scenes where they just take this concept of, this quite codependent couple, or this couple where one person is just ludicrously into the other and just acts a bit weirdly in public because of it. It just takes it to more and more ridiculous extents as the film goes on, to the point where inevitably towards the end you have the bit where it gets actually horrific.
As all horror movies do, it escalates to violence and disturbing, intense things, Yeah, and at that point it kind of pretty much stops being funny.
Yeah. To be fair, I did enjoy some of the way they sort of handled the lore, to the extent that it has lore. The way the sort of the magic is handled, I think, in this film is just quite fun. I think it's weird that part of me's surprised it works as well as it does, but somehow it does. This sort of quite silly little magical toy that turns out to really be magic in a sort of weird way that just sort of turns up and does the business. There's a bit in towards the end where he wants to get more of this magical toy to try and undo this curse, and he goes back to the shop and the shop owner just plays this stupid prank on him and then just makes fun of him, basically. And it's quite close to the end of the film, but otherwise into quite a serious sequence. But there's just this bit with this shopkeeper just ripping the piss out of him, which is a very strange tonal shift, but I very much enjoyed.
Yeah, considering he turns up haggard, covered in blood, things like that. Yeah. And it's an interesting concept. Yeah, like guy goes into a sort of new age spiritually shop, buys something you think is either like a toy or something that you don't think is going to actually be like powerfully magic, turns out to be. I mean, it's a trope that's been around for so long that it's been subverted and joked about like in loads of different ways, like the cursed monkey paw. There's both a Simpsons and a Family Guy episode doing cursed monkey paw, be careful what you wish for sort of thing. And I'm sure they're riffing on older stories and things like that. Definitely, like The Simpsons, obviously, this ironically does in a very 90s way, like, stories from culture, persistent archetypes. And I guess it's a reflection of the fact that we're living in this post-irony world, that they're just straight up doing it again. There's not there's some jokes about it, but there's not a sense of like wink or a nudge to the audience of like basically a guy goes into a new age shop, buys something that says, Willow, make a wish on it, makes a wish, and then the horror begins. That's how basically this sort of regular loser ends up in a horror film. I quite like the fact they're just doing it unironically.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think as ever, the fact that you take the emotion and the actual story seriously means you can get away with other things being a bit silly, maybe. The fact that the actors are so committed to the actual relationship arc, you don't entirely care about how they got into it. To be honest, you probably rather they just did this rather than coming up with some incredibly convoluted explanation that adds another half hour to the film's runtime.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. This is the best version of this film.
Also, there's a bit of subversion in that scene I just mentioned when he goes back to the shop to try and buy more. The obvious thing to happen would be what they kind of hinted at happening was where the shopkeeper goes, "What? We don't say anything like that. We've never sold anything like that." Instead, the joke version unfolds.
Yeah. Which again is like the film walks that line of having those like humorous moments in it. What I also like a lot about this film is there's like plenty kind of like going on about the surface that is very relatable to real life dysfunctional relationships that people have, even though it gets to, like I said, like horror movie intensity. Like, a lot of the obsession is things that actually happen to people and stuff. Like the way she behaves is a kind of abusive, controlling relationship. And I suppose I should probably give some warnings for A, spoilers, and B, things that might be difficult for people to listen to if you have an experience of abuse or things like that. So now's your chance to run away. Not going to drop a massive spoiler, but anyway, also there should be a trigger warning for the next bit. Like, there's several bits when she's in the height of the obsession and she, in order to get his attention, because she needs his undivided, complete, permanent attention, she's like hurts herself and things like that. And that's the thing people in abusive relationships sometimes do, which is they'll hurt themselves for attention or to control other people. Or they'll, create public humiliating situation stuff for people in order to control them. So it is saying something about how abusive relationships work. And also I felt the film was like quite a good portrait of like anxiety and isn't that there's this guy, he's stuck in life, he's really unhappy, uncomfortable with his life, wants change, wants these things, thinks this one thing will make it all better when it really won't. Once he gets it, he can't be happy. He's still basically the same. He's still miserable. And that's kind of like what it's like to live with anxiety, this sense of like, I'm always going to be unhappy, things are always going to be wrong, or depression and things like that. So there are lots of things in this film that are painting accurate pictures of real life as well as horror movie stuff. Yeah.
As I say, I really enjoyed this. I somehow wasn't as bummed out by it as I was worried I might be, but I did really enjoy it. There's one big kill towards the end, which you can probably see coming if you've watched more than 4 or 5 movies in your life, but it didn't ruin my enjoyment of the film, knowing that this was clearly going to happen. Plus, that's not the climax of the film. It does go to some very strange, intense places after that, which I definitely did not predict. So, it's all good.
Yeah, solid ending, which we won't spoil.
Yeah.
It's been a good year. Between this and The Backrooms, it's a good year for horror movies. It's a good year for debut directors from young 20-something internet native former YouTuber horror directors, which sounds oddly specific, but it's bizarre.
But there's like 3 of them, yeah.
yeah, exactly. So it's not what I had on my 2026 cinema bingo card, but I really enjoyed both this film and The Backrooms, and we'll see which ones make it into the final 5 of the year.
Yeah, no, not seen The Backrooms yet, but did really like this. Okay, and that was Moderate Fantasy Violence. Thank you very much, as ever, for listening. If you have enjoyed this podcast, then why not go to our website at moderatefantasyviolence.com, where you can read our articles, listen to our old episodes, and just generally have an amazing time. And if you like that, then please leave us a nice 5-star review on whatever application lets you review podcasts.
And then after that, you can follow us on social media. Head over to Blue Sky, where we are at MFV Podcast, or follow us on Facebook, where we are Moderate Fantasy Violence. You can also find me on Blue Sky, TikTok, and Instagram by searching for Alistair Ball. You can find more of my writing at redtrainblog.com, my theatre reviews at everythingtheatre.com, and my newsletter, The Post, by following any of my social media accounts.
And you can find me online at nickbryan.com. That's both on the internet and on Blue Sky, or on Instagram if you have the word dot instead of a dot. Or, in fact, I too have a newsletter which you can subscribe to at newsletter.nickbryan.com, or the links in most of my social media profiles. Fill your boots. This is all, of course, to talk about my self-published comics, which you should absolutely buy. Or you could also absolutely come back next episode for more Moderate Fantasy Violence, in which we'll be covering the return of 2 TV shows we've been following for a while. We've got the return of X-Men 97, some more sweet nostalgia with a weird undertone of genocide, and then the 3rd season of House of the Dragon. See you in 2 weeks for that. Bye-bye.
Bye.